Overnight, a quiet corner of Brentwood became the center of a tragedy that no one in Hollywood was prepared to process. The kind of story that feels unreal even as police lights cut through the darkness and reporters whisper words like shocking and unthinkable. By the morning of December 15th, 2025, the names Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner were no longer being spoken with admiration or nostalgia, but with disbelief and grief, as news spread that the legendary director and his wife had been found dead inside their own home. For many, it felt like the collapse of something solid and familiar, a reminder that even the most stable public lives can hide storms no one else can see. But for Tracy Reiner, the loss was not an abstract headline or a tragic rumor passed from phone to phone. It was the moment her world fractured beyond repair, a moment that pulled her back through years of memories, warning signs, and a single conversation she would replay in her mind again and again. When she finally appeared in front of cameras, her voice trembling, eyes hollow with exhaustion, she did not speak like someone chasing attention. She spoke like someone standing in the ruins of a life she thought she understood. In her words, there was no anger, only the heavy weight of realization, the sense that something terrible had been building long before anyone outside the family noticed. She described the house not as a crime scene, but as a home once filled with warmth, laughter, and a belief that love could solve almost anything. That belief, she hinted, may have been both the family's greatest strength and its most dangerous illusion. As Tracy began to talk, she drew the audience into a quieter, more unsettling space, away from flashing lights and official statements, and toward a private night in early December that would later feel like a warning no one recognized in time. In a small guest house behind her parents' main residence, she sat across from her younger brother Nick, the air thick with tension she could not immediately explain. There was no dramatic outburst, no shouting, no threats. Instead, there was something far more chilling, a calm desperation, a sense of someone who felt cornered by his own life. He spoke about money, about needing help immediately, about everything collapsing if he did not get it. But beneath those words, Tracy sensed something deeper, something darker, a frustration that went beyond debt or bad decisions. As he spoke, his movements were restless, his focus scattered, his energy uneven, like someone fighting a battle entirely inside his own head. She noticed how he talked about their parents, not with affection or anger, but with a cold detachment that made her uneasy. It was as if he no longer saw them as the people who raised him, but as symbols of control, expectations, and a future he felt shut out of. Tracy did not leave that night with answers, only with a feeling she could not shake, a quiet alarm ringing somewhere deep inside her. Days later, when the news broke and the reality of what had happened could no longer be denied, that feeling returned with devastating clarity. Suddenly, every pause, every strange glance, every unfinished sentence from that night took on new meaning. The tragedy was no longer a sudden act of violence, but the final chapter of a story that had been unfolding for years, hidden behind privacy, hope, and the refusal to believe that love might not be enough. As Tracy spoke, she made it clear that this was not a story about monsters or villains, but about a family slowly worn down by a struggle they never fully understood. The loss of her parents was unbearable on its own, but the knowledge that the warning signs had been there all along made the grief even heavier. In the silence that followed her words, one truth lingered, unsettling and impossible to ignore. This was not a tragedy born in a single moment, but one written quietly over time, waiting for the day it could no longer be contained. Long before tragedy entered their lives, the Reiner household was built on a foundation that, from the outside, looked unshakable, a blend of creativity, discipline, and old Hollywood values passed down through generations. Rob Reiner grew up under the watchful eye of a legendary television father, learning early how success could coexist with pressure and how expectations could shape a child long before they understood them. That legacy followed him into adulthood, not as a burden, but as a responsibility he embraced with intention. When he built his own family, he carried with him a deep belief that structure, honesty, and emotional presence mattered more than appearances. Michelle shared that belief. She was not drawn to the spotlight for its own sake, but to the work, the people, and the sense of purpose it brought. Together, they created a home that valued closeness over spectacle, one where family dinners mattered and privacy was fiercely protected. Their children grew up surrounded by opportunity, but also by rules, expectations, and the quiet understanding that privilege came with accountability. For Tracy, who joined the family through adoption, that environment was grounding. She never felt like an outsider. If anything, she often described her father as steady and unwavering, someone whose approval was earned not through fame or talent, but through trust. That consistency became a source of comfort for her, a sense of safety she would later realize was rare even among successful families. For Nick, however, the same environment felt different. From an early age, he seemed to react more sharply to boundaries, more intensely to criticism, even when it was gentle. Teachers noticed his impulsiveness. Friends saw his restlessness. At home, small frustrations could spiral into emotional storms that left everyone exhausted and confused. It was not a lack of love that shaped him, but an excess of inner noise he struggled to quiet. As he grew older, the contrast between him and his siblings became harder to ignore. Where others found direction, Nick drifted. Where structure brought security, it felt to him like confinement. The shadow of his father's reputation loomed larger with every passing year. No matter what he tried, there was always an unspoken comparison, always the sense that he was being measured against a standard he never agreed to. He wanted to be seen as himself, not as someone's son, yet every introduction, every opportunity seemed to pull him back into that role. In moments of clarity, he admitted that the pressure was not external alone, but internal, a constant voice telling him he was falling behind, failing to become what he was supposed to be. During his teenage years, those feelings began to manifest in more visible ways. He sought out circles that promised freedom and intensity, environments where rules were loose and consequences felt distant. Late nights replaced routines. Impulse replaced planning. The family responded the only way they knew how, with concern and intervention. Therapists were consulted. Programs were recommended. Each step was taken with hope, the belief that the right combination of care and time would help Nick find balance. And sometimes it seemed to work. There were periods when he appeared calmer, more focused, even optimistic. Those stretches gave his parents reason to believe they were making progress, that the worst was behind them. But the calm never lasted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the old patterns returned. Frustration crept back into his voice. Anger resurfaced in his reactions. He resisted schedules, questioned authority, and bristled at any suggestion that he needed guidance. For Rob and Michelle, this created a painful contradiction. They wanted to protect their son, yet they also feared enabling behavior that might harm him in the long run. Experts offered conflicting advice, some urging stricter boundaries, others recommending compassion above all else. Caught between those voices, they often chose empathy, believing that love, patience, and presence would eventually break through. Over time, that choice came at a cost. The emotional energy required to support Nick began to dominate the household. Conversations revolved around his state of mind, his progress, his setbacks. Plans were adjusted, careers rearranged, all to keep him close and safe. The house remained warm, but the tension beneath the surface grew heavier. Tracy observed this shift quietly, sensing how the family's center of gravity had moved. She loved her brother, but she also felt the strain, the way every crisis pulled resources and attention into a single orbit. For Nick, the awareness of that dynamic fed his resentment. He oscillated between gratitude and guilt, between dependence and defiance. He hated feeling like a problem, yet could not escape the behaviors that reinforced that label. As adulthood approached, The gap between who he wanted to be and who he felt he was widened into something painful and volatile. The past was no longer just history. It had become a lens through which every new disappointment was viewed. And without anyone fully realizing it, the emotional groundwork for what would come next was already being laid. By the time the final months of 2025 arrived, the tension that had been quietly shaping the Reiner family for years was no longer something that could be managed with patience or hopeful conversations. It had become visible in small, unsettling ways, the kind that do not immediately register as danger, but leave a lingering sense that something is slipping out of control. Nick's requests for money grew more urgent, no longer framed as temporary help, but as desperate needs that could not wait. His tone shifted from embarrassed explanations to rigid insistence, as if time itself were closing in on him. Tracy noticed that when money came up, his eyes changed first, losing warmth and filling instead with a sharp focus that felt almost mechanical. He spoke faster, repeated himself, and dismissed questions as distractions. What alarmed her most was not the debt itself, but the way he described it, like a collapsing structure that only he could see, pressing down on him from every side. Around the same time, his emotional state became more erratic. Moments of calm were abruptly interrupted by agitation, pacing, and sudden silences that stretched uncomfortably long. Family gatherings began to feel tense, conversations cautious and guarded, as if everyone was instinctively avoiding certain topics without ever naming them. Rob and Michelle sensed it too. They tried to adjust, to de-escalate, to remind themselves that this was just another difficult phase, one they had navigated before. But this time felt different. The familiar rhythm of crisis and recovery was gone, replaced by something heavier, more brittle. Nick no longer spoke about getting better or starting over. Instead, he talked about being misunderstood, about how no one truly listened to him, about how decisions had been made for him his entire life. Underneath those words was a deep resentment that seemed to have hardened over time. Tracy recalled that when he mentioned their parents during that period, his language was stripped of emotion. He did not describe them as loving or controlling, only as obstacles, fixed points in a life he felt trapped inside. That detachment frightened her more than anger ever could. It suggested a separation that had already taken place in his mind, a distancing that allowed him to speak about family as if they were no longer part of his inner world. The night of their private conversation in early December stood out because it concentrated all of those warning signs into a single encounter. In the dim guest house, Nick moved restlessly, sitting and standing, clenching his hands as if trying to contain a surge of energy he could not release. His voice dropped when he spoke about the future, not in fear, but in something closer to resignation. Tracy sensed that he was not asking for help as much as announcing a collapse he believed was inevitable. When she pressed him for clarity, he did not offer details. He spoke in fragments, in vague statements about things needing to change, about patience running out. The air felt suffocating, thick with unspoken meaning. When he stepped closer and fell silent, staring out the window, Tracy's instincts took over. She did not accuse him of anything or demand explanations. She simply left, driven by a sudden certainty that staying longer was a mistake. In the days that followed, she wrestled with whether to tell her parents about that night. The holidays were approaching, emotions already strained, and she feared adding more weight to a family that seemed perpetually on the edge. She told herself she might be overreacting, that anxiety was coloring her memory. Then December 14th arrived, and the illusion of normalcy shattered completely. The news came in fragments at first, whispers and urgent calls, then confirmation from police and media. Rob and Michelle were gone. The house that had anchored the family for decades was now sealed off, transformed into a place of loss and unanswered questions. Tracy's mind raced back to every detail she had tried to dismiss. The silence in the guest house, the cold way Nick spoke, the feeling that had driven her out the door. Suddenly, it all aligned into a pattern she could no longer deny. As investigators worked through the night, Nick was nowhere to be found. Surveillance footage later placed him miles away, moving through the city with a tense, unsettled energy that matched everything Tracy had sensed in him days earlier. When he was finally taken into custody, the relief others might have expected never came. For Tracy, it felt like the closing of a circle she had watched forming for years. The arrest did not answer the deeper question that haunted her. How had a family built on love, effort, and relentless care reached this point? As more details emerged, the past began to cast a harsh light on the present. Nick's history of gambling, his mounting debts, his belief that one final win could erase years of failure, all took on new significance. These were not isolated mistakes, but pieces of a larger unraveling. Each loss had deepened his sense of humiliation. Each loan had reinforced his dependence and his shame. The more his parents tried to help, the more trapped he felt by their involvement. And the more trapped he felt, the more he lashed out, not always in words, but in withdrawal and bitterness. The argument at the Christmas party days earlier, though never fully described, now felt like a breaking point. Witnesses spoke of a shift in the room, of tension that silenced conversations and drew uneasy glances. Tracy did not need details to understand what it meant. She recognized the signs of escalation, the moment when private frustration spills into public space and can no longer be contained. When Rob and Michelle left the party together that night, there was no indication it would be the last time anyone saw them alive. Yet in hindsight, everything about that evening seemed heavy with finality. After the charges were announced and court dates set, the narrative hardened into something the public could digest: a crime, a suspect, a legal process. For Tracy, none of that touched the deeper wound. What devastated her most was the realization that the warning signs had not been invisible. They had been present, repeated, and normalized over time. Each crisis had been survived, each setback absorbed, until survival itself became the goal, replacing the hope of real change. In that sense, the tragedy was not sudden at all. It was the result of years of unresolved pain converging in a moment no one could stop. And as Tracy looked back, she understood that what haunted her was not only what happened, but the knowledge that it had been building quietly, waiting for the moment when silence would finally break. In the days that followed the arrests and court appearances, the shock gave way to a different kind of pain, one that settled slowly and refused to leave. The immediate questions had answers now, at least on paper, but the emotional consequences spread outward in ways no investigation could contain. For Tracy, grief did not arrive as a single overwhelming wave. It came in fragments, moments when reality felt briefly normal before collapsing again under the weight of what had happened. She described waking up and forgetting for a split second, only to remember everything at once: the silence in the house, the absence of familiar voices, the knowledge that nothing could ever be repaired. Losing her parents would have been devastating under any circumstances. Losing them in this way, knowing that the damage came from inside the family, transformed grief into something heavier and more complicated. There was no space for clean mourning, no clear line between love and anger, only a constant collision of emotions that left her exhausted and hollow. The impact on the rest of the family followed a similar pattern. Jake and Romy withdrew from public view almost entirely, issuing a brief statement that spoke only of love and loss, carefully avoiding blame or explanation. Their words were measured, restrained, as if they understood that anything more would invite judgment they were not ready to face. Behind closed doors, however, the absence of their parents reshaped every interaction. Decisions that once would have been shared now fell on shoulders already weighed down by trauma. Family gatherings disappeared, replaced by distance and quiet check-ins that felt fragile and tentative. Even simple conversations carried an unspoken awareness of what had been lost and how. The house in Brentwood, once a symbol of stability and warmth, became something else entirely. Friends described it as feeling emptied of its spirit, a place where memories lingered but comfort no longer lived. For years, that home had been a center of gravity, a space where problems were confronted and love was reaffirmed. Now it stood as a reminder of how long the struggle had lasted and how little control anyone truly had in the end. Tracy admitted that returning there felt unbearable, as if the walls themselves carried echoes of conversations she wished she could revisit, decisions she wished she had made differently. Beyond the family, the reaction from the outside world added another layer of strain. Media coverage was relentless, dissecting timelines, histories, and psychological profiles with clinical detachment. Headlines reduced decades of complex relationships into simplified narratives that demanded villains and explanations. Tracy found this especially painful. She felt that the story was being flattened, stripped of nuance and empathy, turned into something consumable rather than something human. While some voices expressed sympathy and restraint, others speculated freely, drawing conclusions that ignored the years of effort, care, and love that had defined her parents' lives. The public fascination with the tragedy made it harder for the family to grieve privately, forcing them to navigate their pain under constant observation. The emotional consequences extended beyond grief into deep self-questioning. Tracy spoke openly about guilt, about replaying past moments, and wondering whether different choices might have changed the outcome. Should she have told her parents more forcefully about that night in the guest house? Should boundaries have been set earlier or more firmly? These questions had no answers, yet they returned relentlessly, feeding a sense of responsibility she could not escape. At the same time, she struggled with compassion for her brother, a feeling that existed alongside anger and disbelief. Loving someone who caused irreparable harm created an internal conflict that left her feeling divided against herself. She described it as carrying two truths at once, neither of which could erase the other. One truth was that her parents had been deeply loving, devoted, and patient. The other was that their devotion had not been enough to prevent catastrophe. For those closest to the family, the tragedy prompted uncomfortable reflections about help, responsibility, and limits. Friends who had watched the Reiners navigate years of struggle admitted that they had often admired the parents' persistence, seeing it as evidence of unconditional love. In hindsight, that same persistence raised painful questions about whether endless support can sometimes delay necessary confrontation with reality. Professionals debated the case quietly, acknowledging how difficult it is to balance compassion with accountability, especially when mental health, addiction, and family dynamics intertwine. There were no clear lessons, only reminders of how fragile even the most well-intentioned systems can be. For Tracy, the most lasting impact was the loss of certainty. Before everything happened, she believed in a kind of emotional logic, the idea that effort, honesty, and love would eventually lead to resolution. Afterward, that belief was shattered. She no longer trusted that doing everything right could protect the people she loved. This realization changed how she viewed the past and the future alike. The memories of her parents were still filled with warmth, but now they were tinged with sorrow, with the knowledge that their lives had been consumed by a struggle that never truly ended. Their legacy, she felt, was not defined by the way they died, but by how they lived, even as she wrestled with the reality that their lives had been profoundly shaped by pain. As weeks turned into months, the legal process moved forward, steady and impersonal, while the emotional aftermath remained unresolved. Court dates and charges provided structure, but no closure. The family learned to exist in a new reality, one where absence was permanent and healing uncertain. Tracy summed it up quietly, saying that some losses do not fade with time. They settle into you, altering how you move through the world. The tragedy had taken her parents, fractured her family, and dismantled assumptions she once held about love and control. What remained was the difficult work of carrying that weight forward, knowing that the consequences of what happened would echo far beyond the moment itself. As the noise around the case slowly softened, a quieter layer of the story began to surface, one that rarely reached headlines but lived on in private memories and late-night conversations. These were the moments Tracy described as the hardest to carry, not because they were dramatic, but because they revealed how deeply her parents had tried to hold the family together when no one else was watching. Long before police reports in courtrooms, there were countless small decisions made behind closed doors, choices guided by love rather than certainty. Tracy remembered evenings when her parents sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, speaking in low voices about what to do next, how to help without losing their son entirely. There were no raised voices, no theatrics, just exhaustion and fear wrapped in determination. They believed that if they stayed present, if they refused to turn away, something would eventually shift. That belief shaped years of their lives. They rearranged schedules, postponed personal plans, and accepted disruptions as part of daily reality. Tracy recalled how her mother would quietly prepare meals even during periods of intense tension, maintaining routines as if structure itself might offer stability. Her father, Rob Reiner, often tried to lighten the atmosphere with gentle humor, not to dismiss the problem, but to remind everyone that they were still a family, still connected by more than crisis. These gestures seemed small at the time, almost invisible, yet they carried immense emotional weight. One story that stayed with Tracy involved a yoga instructor who had worked with the family years earlier. During a particularly difficult session, Nick had broken down completely, pacing, shouting, and crying in a way that frightened those present. What stood out was not the intensity of his emotions, but her parents' response. They did not call for help or retreat into another room. They stayed, silent and steady, waiting for the storm to pass. That moment, Tracy said, captured who they were better than any public image. They believed that staying was an act of love, even when it hurt. Over time, these private acts of loyalty accumulated, forming a pattern of endurance that few people outside the family ever saw. There were periods when Nick disappeared for weeks, cutting off contact. During those times, Tracy remembered her parents sleeping with their phones beside them, waking at every vibration, every unfamiliar sound. Nights blurred into mornings as they waited for any sign that he was safe. Friends would later say they had no idea how heavy that burden had become. To the outside world, Rob and Michelle continued to appear composed, attending events, meeting obligations, smiling when expected. Behind that composure was a constant undercurrent of worry that never fully receded. Tracy also spoke about the moments of hope that made everything feel worthwhile. There were stretches when Nick seemed calmer, more grounded, when he spoke about wanting a different life, about starting fresh. During those times, the family allowed themselves to imagine an ending that did not involve constant fear. They talked about the future cautiously, aware of how fragile progress could be. Those moments made the setbacks harder to accept, because each return to chaos felt like losing the same person all over again. The repetition created a strange emotional rhythm, anticipation followed by disappointment, relief followed by dread. Tracy described it as living in a state of emotional suspension, never fully relaxed, never fully prepared for what came next. Another quiet detail that haunted her was how often her parents questioned themselves. They sought advice relentlessly, moving between therapists, doctors, and support programs, hoping to find clarity. Yet the guidance they received was often contradictory. Some urged firmness, warning against enabling behavior. Others emphasized empathy and patience, cautioning that withdrawal could be dangerous. Caught between these perspectives, Rob and Michelle made choices that felt right in the moment, even when they doubted them later. Tracy remembered overhearing her father say that he sometimes felt like he was choosing between two wrong answers, knowing that either path carried risk. Those doubts never left them, but they refused to let uncertainty turn into abandonment. For Tracy, witnessing this shaped her understanding of love in a way she would not fully grasp until much later. She came to see that love could be both sustaining and destructive, capable of holding people together while also exhausting them. In the aftermath of the tragedy, these memories became heavier, not because they suggested failure, but because they revealed how much effort had been poured into a situation that still ended in loss. Tracy found herself clinging to small, almost mundane recollections: the sound of her parents talking softly in another room, the way her mother squeezed her hand during tense conversations, the look on her father's face when he believed, even briefly, that things might finally improve. These fragments felt more real than any public narrative. They were proof that the family had not been passive, that they had fought quietly and consistently against a tide that never fully receded. In sharing these stories, Tracy did not seek to absolve or condemn. She wanted to show the human complexity behind the tragedy, the countless moments of care that existed alongside the chaos. To her, these silent efforts were part of her parents' true legacy, not the circumstances of their deaths, but the way they chose to love, even when love offered no guarantees. As the story moved further from the shock of what happened and closer to the quieter work of understanding it, Tracy found herself thinking less about the final days and more about what her parents' lives had truly represented. In the public imagination, their names were tied to success, creativity, and a kind of steady professionalism that felt reassuring in an industry known for chaos. But in private, their legacy was far more complicated and far more human. It was a legacy shaped not by awards or recognition, but by the choices they made when no one was watching, especially the choice to keep showing up even when hope felt thin. Tracy began to see that their lives were defined by a tension that never fully resolved, the tension between unconditional love and the painful reality that love does not always heal what is broken. For years, her parents lived with the belief that perseverance itself was a moral act, that staying present was better than walking away, no matter how exhausted they became. That belief guided them through countless moments of doubt. It also quietly reshaped their identities, turning their roles as parents into a constant balancing act between care and survival. In the aftermath, Tracy wrestled with what that devotion meant. On one hand, she felt immense pride. Few people would have endured what her parents did without closing their hearts. On the other, she could not ignore the cost. Their lives became narrower over time, centered increasingly on crisis management rather than shared joy. Vacations were postponed, plans tentative, conversations always circling back to the same unresolved fears. The world still saw them as accomplished and composed, but inside the family, everything revolved around keeping one person afloat. That realization forced Tracy to confront a difficult truth. Love can be heroic, but it can also quietly consume the people who practice it most fiercely. This understanding did not diminish her parents in her eyes. If anything, it deepened her respect for them. They chose compassion even when it drained them. They chose patience even when it offered no clear reward. Yet Tracy also recognized that their story challenged a comforting narrative many people cling to: the idea that enough care, enough effort, enough sacrifice will always lead to redemption. Her parents' lives stood as proof that sometimes there are no clean resolutions, only choices made in uncertainty. Reflecting on her own place in that legacy, Tracy spoke about how the tragedy altered her sense of responsibility and identity. She no longer believed that being the strong one meant absorbing everyone else's pain without question. Watching her parents carry so much for so long taught her that strength without limits can become a quiet form of self-erasure. In that sense, their story became both an inspiration and a warning. It inspired her to value empathy and loyalty, but also warned her about the danger of losing oneself entirely in the effort to save another. The idea of legacy, she realized, was not about how people are remembered publicly, but about what their lives teach those closest to them. Her parents taught her how deeply humans can care and how fragile even the strongest bonds can be when tested endlessly. They taught her that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes, and that failure does not always mean a lack of effort. These lessons were painful, but they were real, and Tracy felt a responsibility to honor them honestly rather than hide behind comforting myths. As she spoke about the future, Tracy did not frame her parents' lives as a cautionary tale meant to assign blame. Instead, she described them as an invitation to reflect, an invitation to ask where the line lies between helping and losing oneself, an invitation to acknowledge that mental health struggles and addiction do not exist in isolation, but ripple outward, reshaping entire families. She believed that if her parents' story had any lasting meaning, it was in prompting these uncomfortable questions rather than offering simple answers. Their lives, she said, were filled with light, laughter, and generosity, even as they were shadowed by an ongoing battle that never truly ended. Holding both truths at once was the hardest part. In the quiet moments after interviews ended and cameras were gone, Tracy found herself returning to memories that felt almost ordinary. Her parents laughing at the dinner table, small gestures of affection, the sense of being understood without explanation. These memories reminded her that legacy is not erased by tragedy. It is complicated by it. Her parents were not defined by how they died, nor solely by the struggle they endured, but by the way they lived through that struggle with dignity and care. Their story, in the end, was not about failure. It was about the limits of love in a world that often demands more than any family can give. That understanding did not bring peace, but it brought clarity. And for Tracy, clarity was the first step toward carrying their legacy forward without being crushed by it. As the story reaches its quietest point, what remains is not resolution, but a space filled with reflection and unanswered questions. Tracy understood that there would be no ending that made sense of everything, no statement or verdict capable of restoring what had been lost. What she could do, however, was speak honestly about what the tragedy had taken and what it had revealed. For her, the most painful realization was that the warning signs were never hidden. They existed in conversations that felt slightly off, in behaviors that caused unease, in moments when intuition whispered that something was wrong. Yet, like many families living inside long-term crisis, they had learned to adapt, to normalize instability, to believe that survival itself was proof of progress. That belief carried them forward for years, until it no longer could. In sharing her parents' story, Tracy was not searching for sympathy. She was searching for understanding, for a way to honor lives that had been defined by care, even as they were overtaken by tragedy. She spoke about grief not as a single emotion, but as a shifting landscape. Some days it arrived as sharp pain, other days as numbness, and sometimes as guilt so heavy it felt physical. Loving her parents meant mourning them not only as individuals, but as the people they were forced to become while fighting a battle that never truly ended. Loving her brother meant holding compassion alongside irrevocable loss. These contradictions did not cancel each other out. They existed together, shaping a reality that defied simple explanation. Tracy acknowledged that many people wanted a clear lesson from what happened, a rule that could prevent similar outcomes. She resisted that impulse. If her parents' lives had taught her anything, it was that human struggles do not follow neat patterns. There is no formula that guarantees safety, no amount of love that ensures control over another person's choices. What can exist, she said, is awareness. Awareness of how easily concern turns into silence. Awareness of how fear of conflict can delay necessary conversations. Awareness of how families can become trapped between hope and denial without realizing it. By telling her story, Tracy hoped to create space for those reflections, not to accuse, but to invite honesty. She wanted her parents to be remembered not for the violence that ended their lives, but for the compassion that defined them. They were people who believed fiercely in staying, in trying again, in refusing to abandon someone they loved. That belief was both their strength and their vulnerability. Remembering them meant holding that complexity without simplifying it into heroism or failure. As time moved forward, Tracy accepted that healing would not mean forgetting. It would mean learning how to carry grief without letting it erase everything else. She spoke about rebuilding a sense of self in a world where the anchors of her life were gone, about redefining family in the absence of those who once held it together. This process, she admitted, was slow and uncertain. Some wounds do not close. They simply become part of who you are. Yet even in that uncertainty, Tracy found purpose in speaking. Purpose in refusing to let silence be the final chapter. The case would continue through the legal system, headlines would fade, and public attention would shift elsewhere. What would remain were the quiet conversations sparked by the story, the moments when viewers recognized pieces of their own lives reflected back at them. Tracy believed that if people paused to consider the limits of love, the importance of boundaries, and the courage required to confront uncomfortable truths, then something meaningful could still emerge from loss. Her parents' legacy, she felt, lived in those reflections. It lived in every person who chose to listen more carefully, to speak sooner, to take emotional distress seriously before it hardened into something irreversible. As she finished telling the story, Tracy did not offer closure. She offered presence, an acknowledgement that some tragedies cannot be undone, only understood more deeply over time. She invited those listening to sit with the discomfort rather than rush past it, to remember that behind every headline is a family shaped by years of invisible struggle. In that shared recognition, she hoped there might be a small measure of connection, a reminder that even in the darkest stories, humanity still matters.